Hello, everyone. I'm Jen Beck, Community Relations Manager with National Technology Council. Welcome, and we're glad you're here. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Bill Wright. He's the Senior Director, Learning Center of Excellence with HCA Healthcare Information Technology Group. So, Bill, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Well, I'm Bill Wright, and I'm thrilled to be with you today. Thanks for having me. I give you a little bit about background. I think background is really important. Context is important. I think story is important. We'll talk a lot about that today. But by virtue of background, I was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan. You get three career choices when you grow up in Detroit, and that's GM, Ford, or Chrysler, at least when I was growing up. And I ended up with General Motors. And we'll talk a lot about my experience with General Motors. It's really important as part of my story, and I think it applies to this class as well. I then spent 21 plus years with GM and ended up here at HCA in Nashville for the last 19 years. So I've really had two careers in two very different vertical industries with two extremely different cultures. And I'll try to blend some of that in as we go through the presentation today. I'll try to bring some of my personal experience to it from both of those, what I would consider very important parts of my life story. So let's get started. I'm a big believer in the importance of story. I wasn't always that way, but I do believe that story does a variety of things for us. Number one, it connects us at some level, whether it's an indirect connection or a direct connection. Some of our stories really resemble each other very closely. It establishes that sense of community, which I think is how we were engineered or designed or whatever the case may be. I believe that with all of my heart. I don't think we were supposed to be alone in this equation. And so sharing story is important for leaders or individual performers, doesn't matter. Story is important because it allows you to take an introspective look at yourself, and telling story puts you in a very vulnerable posture. I believe that vulnerability is the greatest characteristic of a leader, of an individual team player, of the ideal team player. We'll see that in just a second, because it breeds humility. And, fundamentally, humility is going to find you or you find it, but you will be humbled in some way, shape, or form would be my experience. And I think the experience of most. So I found this book extremely intriguing because it talked about the virtues. I want to make a distinction between virtues and values. Virtues are the way that values manifest themselves. It's the way they play out. Virtues are real, they're practical. Values are principles, okay? And so we're going to use that word virtue a lot because that's what we're talking about. What are the ideal virtues of a team player? And I'm going to give you a way to think about it. So whether you're a leader that's trying to build out a team of ideal team players, or you're just an individual performer that's trying to be an ideal team player, I think you'll find this information useful for sure, and certainly a very easy model to use as a frame of reference going forward. So with that, I'm going to kind of go over and talk about, let me get on my right slide here. I'm not doing that well. Let me do it real quick. I'm getting warning messages. Hold on. Oh, I love our information security folks. They're so good at this. Okay, here we go. So I want to spend a few minutes, if you wouldn't mind, in chat, tell me what you think the three most important attributes of a team player are. And we'll say those are virtues, just like I mentioned to you. What do you think the three most important attributes or virtues of a team player are? And just use chat to kind of put down your answers. There's no wrong answer, so we're good. I think I can see chat.
I would say maybe communication, and Stacy has raised her hand. Go ahead. I think you can unmute yourself, Stacy, if I've gotten to you and ask your question.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just hit the button by accident.
No, no problem. I was going to say communication is something I was thinking. Good communication.
Okay, good communication. I like that. Anybody else? Three most important attributes of an ideal team player.
I would say being a good listener.
Oh, very good, Abigail. That's fantastic. Good listening. Yep, good listening skills. By the way, difference between reflective listening, which we're taught in school and most of our life to ensure understanding, if I heard you correctly, you were saying, and active listening. And I'm going to talk a lot about active listening today. So keep that in mind. There is a difference. Good call out, Abigail. What else? I've heard listening and communication. Very similar, by the way. One is a component.
Look, I
of the other.
think transparency, and the other one linked to communication is collaboration and
I like it.
results
That's
from every
great.
team member.
Collaboration, results, and transparency. Excellent.
And also, for
What
the
else?
sake of time, also staying on focus on topic.
On topic. Okay. Yep. Stay focused. I like it. Hey, those are all great suggestions. Those are all great attributes for sure. But Lencioni, as I mentioned, is part of the Table Group. Table Group is a very high-end consulting firm out of San Francisco. He actually spent a lot of time with one of the larger consulting firms in the world prior to going to the Table Group and starting that back in the 80s and 90s, early 90s. And what he found at the end of his tenure with that very large organization was that the clients that they visited, every one of them shared these three specific attributes or virtues when they talked about or when they witnessed what an ideal team player looks like in their organization. So this is an evidence-based representation. All of those things you brought up were very good. They're all important attributes, but these three in particular really, really stand out. So let's go ahead and take a look at what they are. We had 3 minutes, but I'm not going to use them. Here we go. I love this diagram. It's fantastic because it paints, and it's the most sophisticated I ever get in PowerPoint. I promise you that. What Lencioni would say is what he noticed amongst clients is there are really three virtues that every ideal team player embodies that he experienced in his time with this consulting firm, working with these clients, and since has also experienced with the Table Group. And the first one, and I list it first because it's the most important one, and that is humility. Or being humble. We talked a little bit about that. We're going to talk a lot about it. The second one is being hungry. And I'm not talking about how I feel right now because we're getting near dinner time. And actually, I'm pretty hungry most of the times. But this is that innate desire to do more, to learn more, to thirst for more, to hunger for more, to just be in this posture of needing to do more. That sense of hunger, if you will. And the final one is smart. And thank goodness he wasn't talking about intellectual properties here because I would be excluded and that would be just such a shame. But what he was really talking about is smart in terms of understanding the environment or the context in which you're operating and how to best navigate your way through it by leveraging the collective knowledge of those around you, by being able to pave a path through the polity or governance that exists within an organization. It's being acutely aware of your surroundings and being more than just aware, but able to practically navigate it in a very efficient way. So I'm going to pause there for a second. Any questions on any of those three? Did they surprise you? I'm kind of curious to know. Maybe one or two of you can chime in. Did it surprise you? Especially humility.
Go ahead, Hunter. You can unmute.
Well, I think when people talk about emotional maturity in teams, the humility is the bedrock because they're people who have developed that are extremely low drama and they're almost unoffendable, which means that their responses and their interactions tend to be much more productive and on point.
It's fantastic, Hunter. It's a great observation. Hunter, are you related to Lori by any chance?
I am related to Lori.
Okay. Tell her I said hello. Anyways, back to regularly scheduled programming. You're right on, Hunter. Absolutely. Humility for a leader, I didn't understand this. I really didn't, but it's so vitally important because it causes you to have to interrogate yourself first. And coming to grips with yourself first, even as an individual team player, is vitally important before you can effectively work with others. I worked out of many compartments in my life, especially at General Motors. And when I worked out of those compartments, one of the things I did is I sacrificed my identity. I really didn't embrace my identity because I wasn't humble enough to really deal with some of the issues. I just masked them in such a way that I could go into any situation and compartmentalize in such a way that I thought I was being effective and at the same time causing myself a real crisis, quite frankly. So super important. Humility is kind of innate to who you are and where you exist and the context in which you exist. Now, what he would say about
Chris Carter put in the chat window, which I have enabled the chat window now.
Oh.
They moved the setting for me, so it took me a minute. But conversational is much better, I think. So feel free to keep asking. Chris said a humble person has an open mind and is open to different options.
Has an open mind. Yeah, you're exactly right. That's a great point. Yeah, they recognize they don't have all the answers, so they're open to those answers. That's what I mean. You kind of have to get here first and understand, really knowing what you don't know. I would tell an early leader or any really strong individual team player, I would tell them, getting to the place that you know what you don't know is vitally important, but it's only the first step. Acting on what you don't know to go acquire it is the most important part. And that takes humility to go and say, I don't know. I'm really not sure. And make that step forward. So that's a great point. I love that. Okay, I'll watch the chat window now too. I'll do a better job of that for sure. Okay, one thing that Lencioni would say in his book is that the ideal team player doesn't have to be, super strong in all three of these areas, but they have to have an adequate amount of humility, an adequate amount of hunger, and an adequate amount of smart. That's a really important word, because who do you think defines what adequate is? The environment does. I can tell you that without a shadow of a doubt. But he says, if you're significantly deficient in any one of these virtues, which again, the environment dictates that, and I'll use my GM example in just a moment. If you're significantly deficient in any one of these or multiple ones of these, that becomes a challenge. And that's where there needs to be some work to become an ideal team player. So I'm going to use that as a jumping off point, and I'm going to use some illustrations. Let me give you some warnings before we get started. Be careful about labeling. I can't stand labeling. I don't know how you feel, but I think it creates a lot of unhealthiness within us when we label. I struggle with things like ENTJs and blue, gold, purples, and you name it. All these different personality tests. I think they're useful. I think what happens to them is they become a convenient label. And what that does is it limits the way we think about people and the way that we engage them. And it also creates, from their perspective, an unwarranted and unnecessary limitation for them. And that's just not good. So just be careful. For example, if we were to say somebody's really strong in hunger, but they're lacking a little bit, maybe they're adequate or maybe even significantly deficient in the area of humility. Well, we don't want to go and label them, okay? And I'm going to give you some labels here, but they're not to be ascribed to folks. They're meant to be used as a reference model. Wrongly labeling can be really damaging, both for you and for the person you're labeling. Don't assign to real team players just because they are stronger. That's a real temptation. You go, that's a really strong team player because they are really strong there. Hey, if they're adequate in those areas, they're all equal because they're sufficient for the environment in which they are, working. And don't pigeonhole people. Seek to identify or develop more effectively. So what you want to be careful of is taking one of these virtues. Let's say somebody's strong in it and they get all these assignments because they're strong in it. Well, what about the development opportunity where they might be deficient or significantly deficient? That's even more important to develop them. Conversely, don't spend all your time there. You have to kind of balance, knowing that the person is strong in one area but not necessarily strong in the other. And try to really feed work that takes advantage of their genius or their strength, and really play into their development opportunities as well. So just keep it balanced. So humility is the most important virtue without a shadow of a doubt. Now, when I talk about humility, there's really three things I want to talk to you about. There's that true humility. That's what we're after. Kind of that lowly of heart, not arrogant, not boastful, not ready to, they're always ready to serve. They have the servant posture. They're teachable. Just like you mentioned, they're open to feedback. They embrace it. They actually invite it. They celebrate the success of others first. They don't self-advance. They aren't seeking to just simply focus on self. That's true humility. It's starting from that posture. The other one I want to talk to you about is false humility. Now, false humility is when you think poorly of yourself. Remember, humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less. It's not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking less of yourself. Now, thinking of yourself less. Thinking poorly of oneself is really interesting. That's the catalyst usually for false humility. Somebody has a general insecurity. They don't feel real good about themselves. Low self-esteem tends to kind of play in here. They feel inferior. So what they do is they take credit for someone else's work and then they pretend to be modest about it. So they don't really do anything. This is a really dangerous one, this false humility. In fact, it's the most dangerous form of humility. You really want to keep your eyes open to it. More importantly, you want to ask yourself, is this me? Do I have this virtue? Is this something I really need to work on? And if it is, I really encourage you to deal with that. Because at some point in your career, it will get called out. Somebody will see that. I just had this happen 2 weeks ago with one of my team members. And I had to eventually hold them accountable because they were unwilling to think through it themselves and really recognize self-awareness was not necessarily revealing that quality or that virtue. And that was kind of hard to do, to be honest. And then there's pride, general pride. These are folks that typically just, they're conceited. They feel superior and they even tend to be arrogant. Now, I want to do a real quick test here. Okay, I'm going to watch for the chat now since it's on. Which one do you think is the most difficult or the most dangerous? False humility or pride? Again, we're after true humility, this idea of not being arrogant or boastful, being in that servant posture, always looking for that opportunity to contribute to a larger cause and not do it with the idea that you're going to receive anything in the form of affirmation. Okay, I'm seeing pride. I'm seeing pride. False humility, false humility. Okay, we're tied. Somebody break it. Pride, false humility. Okay, you're making this hard on me. You're balancing it way too much. They are really both really challenging ones, but false humility by far is the hardest virtue to really work with. Okay, why do you think that is? Anybody have an idea in chat? Why do you think that would be the case? Why would false humility be so dangerous, so lethal, quite frankly?
You can unmute and just say your answer if you'd like to.
Yeah, that's fine. Yep.
I guess it's like harder to detect. Probably they themselves are not even aware of that.
The lack of self-awareness is a huge issue. You know, when you interrogate yourself with honesty and you're really transparent, genuine, and authentic about what is the motivation of your heart. Did you notice true humility is a heart condition? Did you know that? It isn't necessarily how it manifests itself, it's what's the motivation behind it. That really defines what true humility is. And it's the same thing with false humility. It has the very same thing. It ends up being a heart condition. And if that heart condition is not necessarily interrogated, and when somebody's not real self-aware or doesn't value self-awareness, it doesn't get interrogated well, somebody's going to have to call it out for them. Most often the individual will defend that. They'll kind of, you know, they've created their own narrative about why they act the way they do, and they haven't been honest with themselves in the first place. And so that's a really difficult thing to do. That can actually become pathological at some point. I won't get into neuroscience, but that can become a challenge because they've created a narrative, a script, if you will, to tell themselves to justify this behavior. And it feels completely normal. And they've never interrogated themselves in a really honest way. And they certainly haven't looked at their motivation for what they do. Okay, so false humility is a really difficult one. That was a great call out. It's exactly right. All right, so going forward, let's see if I can do this. Yeah, I can do this. Humility, let's talk about this. As I mentioned, C.S. Lewis said, I love C.S. Lewis writing, someone who is humble does not think less of themselves, rather they think of themselves less. I said that. And I also mentioned that you need to humble yourself or life will do it for you. And I am a living example of that, trust me, in many different ways. The only reason I'm here in Nashville, Tennessee is I got a dose of humility. Life finally caught up with me and humbled me. And it put me in a great posture for the rest of I could tell you right now with 7 grandkids, 3 kids, and a beautiful wife I've been with for 43 years. The humility, the experience I went through was painful. It was difficult. It was challenging, but I'm a better version of each one of those roles I just shared with you today because I did it. And by the way, I'm a better leader today because of this. And you know why that is? when I wasn't exercising humility, I thought that I was fooling people. I thought that I could compartmentalize and just be boss Bill or pastor Bill or employee Bill or dad or you name the role. And the problem that I mentioned at the beginning is that becomes a bit of an internal conflict for you. And you begin to sacrifice your true identity. And you really never know who you really are. You just play to the audience that you are part of at that particular juncture. So if you don't humble yourself, and it is a choice, you can actually humble yourself by getting real with yourself and understand the context in which you're operating each day and understanding what your true contribution is and how badly you need others. There's that community piece that we talked about at the beginning. It's so vitally important, so vitally important. So I encourage you to go find it before it finds you, because it's painful when it finds you, for sure. All right, so this is the best way to think about the idea that somebody is humble. We said it's the most important virtue, but we also said it's not enough. If somebody is adequate as it relates to humility, a team player, but they don't have hunger and they don't really have smart, or they're significantly deficient there, then they're easily manipulated. You see how that works? You can almost acquiesce in such a way that you really have no voice. And anything that happens around you and to you ends up being your regular daily compass. So you're manipulated by all of the things happening around you because you're in this posture of just not being very hungry, not having that voice, and not being very smart about the manipulation that's taken place in the first place. When you're doing that, the person, the ideal team player that has humility as a virtue, but not hunger and not smart, fails to get things done through others. And that's because they're not real smart. They don't understand the importance of it. While they're humble, they don't really understand that there's an entire network or ecosystem around them that they can tap into to get things done and do it in a much more collaborative. Somebody use that right up front as one of our virtues, a much more collaborative way. They lack the ability to navigate organizations effectively. They're very clumsy because they don't really, that's not their virtue. They're deficient in that virtue. So they don't understand it. They don't really embrace it. And so it's a very awkward thing for them. And because they haven't, by the way, since they haven't built the collateral in the organization by collaborating often, it's very difficult because they don't know many people. They don't know how to leverage them well. They don't build effective relationships very well at all. The good news is most don't make it through the interview process. You usually can call this out right away because you're usually focused on results. Tell me about experiences and tell me about results and tell me about concrete things that you've achieved. And somebody that's humble will be very slow to offer that. And because they're not hungry and smart, you're going to call it out right away and see that this may be an issue after all. However, especially in organizations that value, where their cultures really value, HCA is a familial culture. It has a very deep heritage. Preservation of that heritage is very important. And collaboration and community matter. They really do. I'm not just doing a commercial or an infomercial for HCA. It just tends to have that kind of culture, probably because the Frist family is so actively engaged from the beginning and has been all the way through even to this day. Well, having said that, the bad news about someone that's just humble but lacking in hunger and smarts is once they get in, because they're generally really nice and you're in a culture that really values that, they can last a long time in an organization without getting a lot done. And so that can be a real challenge. When I think of that, the pawn, the person that's just humble, easily manipulated, doesn't really understand, not real hungry to get anything done, doesn't understand the value of networks or community and collaboration, are content just to be and to be used. Tell me what you want me to do. It reminds me a little bit of C-3PO. Now, does everybody remember what C-3PO is? C-3PO was a droid protocol, a protocol droid. And really, C-3PO was just there to kind of help with etiquette and be an assistant. And he was just content to be and be used. And so that's a vision I get when I think of the pawn, that person that has humility but lacks hunger and smarts. Okay, I'll pause there real quick. We're going to go on to the second one. I'm going to give you a model for each one of these to remember. Okay, the bulldozer. I was a bulldozer, so I can speak to this one very passionately. At GM, I worked in a culture that embraced the bulldozer mentality, so it worked really well for me. Remember, I told you that the environment kind of dictates what adequate and significantly deficient looks like. It dictates what by virtue of their values, what virtues are important, most important to them. And at GM, it was a very commodity-based, performance and productivity oriented organization. Very protocol strong. That meant the boxes and the lines really mattered. And that's what really influenced culture overall. The bulldozer is somebody that's not very humble. Okay, so they're not in a posture of servant and embracing community and really coming. They want to get things done, period. They're hungry. And they're not very smart. So they're like the proverbial bull in a china shop. I mean, they just got to get it done. And they don't understand the collateral damage they can leave behind by just getting it done. At GM, that was actually rewarded. That was an environment that rewarded that kind of thing in terms of promotions, bonuses, you name it. So I was very early in my career trained or conditioned by my environment to really exacerbate that particular virtue because it was highly valued. Unfortunately, it did me a huge disservice as it relates to humility. And I shared that with you. So humility had to find me. Now, I was relatively smart, so I was probably more than a bulldozer. I'll give you probably the better characteristic of who I was, but there was no doubt that I valued, like the organization did, being hungry, the desire to get more done, to learn more, to really make it happen. And where results in the bottom line are what matter most, you can succeed. And that was GM for me. But you don't succeed if you have to depend on others, because they're going to be an impediment to you. They're going to be an obstacle or a challenge to you. And these are really people that can tend to be a bit narcissistic at times, honestly, and certainly very self-advancing and very selfish.
Chris said in the comment window, that sounds like that can be dangerous to oneself.
It can. It is. Yeah. So I'll give you my story real quick. I promise you, I got to go quick. So I apologize. There's a lot of material to cover, but it's really fun. Hopefully you're having fun. I'm having fun. So what happened is I had a father that was abusive. And I didn't know you could say that, by the way, out loud. This is part of learning to tell my story and being honest about who I am. So I hid that for a long time. Well, there was a lot of physical and mental and emotional abuse that happened in my household. So we just kind of avoided my father. And thank goodness he was busy with other things and didn't have time for us anyways. That probably helped a little bit. Alcoholism was his disease. And the more he drank, the worse it got for us. So when that happens to you, neuroscience says, well, you got these neural paths and you got to kind of figure out how you're going to deal with this trauma. And there was a lot of it. I won't go into my story. I tell my story for 2 hours sometimes in our storytelling class. You're like, thank goodness this is only going to last 20 more minutes. If I had time, I would tell you that story. But what I will tell you is the important part about it. Neuroscience says when we hit trauma, we just create another neural path. We create an alternate path because it's too painful. And when we do that, create that path, it's called the path of least resistance. You might have heard of that. Actually comes out of neuroscience. When we do that, what happens is if the more we take that path, it becomes our natural path. But remember, we got to put a script behind it to support that path. Okay. And we talked about that earlier. Mine was my father was not able to give me the love that I desired and I deserved because I wasn't producing at a high enough level for him to make him proud of me. And, you know, it's a noble cause. Neuroscience will say this. That's a noble cause to take this idea of the blame or the guilt or the shame on yourself. Because inherently, we all like to control things. We're all control freaks at some level. Or at least we want to perceive that we have control. There's a desire on our part as human beings to want to control things. And if we blame ourselves, guess what? We feel like we can fix that. You get how that works? It's kind of weird. It's almost backwards, but it really is true. Well, because I did that, I substituted his addiction of alcohol in my life with an addiction for work. And I was trying to find somebody, a reward system, whether it was church, school, community, family, or work. And GM just happened to have a culture that said, if you outproduce and you outperform, you can go straight up the ladder. And I did, just to be honest. I went through a very quick trajectory in my career. And I'm not going to go into the rest of the story. I'm telling you that to say it is vitally important to understand that it is not good for you to subscribe to those things and not get real with yourself. I didn't, and I would encourage you, especially if you're early in your career, to really get real with yourself and to make it an objective or a goal of yourself to bring to the workplace, in whatever capacity you are, the most genuine and authentic version of yourself that you can. To do that is going to require a tremendous amount of introspective interrogation of the heart. I wish I would have done that. I got to do that coming to HCA. And the way that that happened made me do that. I didn't have a choice. I had to deal with that. Okay. So I give you that little excerpt of my story to kind of illustrate the point. So unfortunately, with the bulldozer, they're the ones that typically get all the credit. You know, corporate America, I just shared this in another class with our leadership out of the Capital Division in Richmond. Unfortunately, corporate America in particular has always rewarded results. I remember at GM thinking, I got this whole thing figured out. They're going to give me a reward if I fix a problem. Well, I know what I'll do. I'll just go create the problem. They never talk about that. There's no punitive action for the person that created it. There's always the, did you see what Bill did? He fixed this. Well, why don't we ask the question, why did it happen in the first time? That question was never asked. We bought into this idea that fixing things, getting results, hitting the bottom line, whatever the case is everything. And so we've actually promoted this idea of these hungry people as being results oriented. They just want to get things done. And that's the kind of folks we need on our team. Well, that really minimizes or actually completely dilutes the value of other important virtues and attributes of other team players. So let's see what this looks like real quick. I want you to watch this play. I want you to see what it looks like to be hungry. Let me give you a little bit of an idea of what's happening here. This is the Super Bowl. The quarterback's getting ready to make a throw to the receiver. I'm going to try to keep it low in case you aren't familiar with football. Their receivers are in purple, so ideally they want to get it to somebody in purple. If the orange intercept it, then they're going to take it. They have a potential to take it back. This is at the very end of the game. And so they have a chance. This is a very important play. They've got to complete this pass. Well, watch what happens in this particular series. Oh, I did that wrong. Sorry. That was funny. Okay. Here we go. So watch what happens. You're going to see hungry in just a second. This is what a bulldozer looks like. Not very smart, not very humble. Orange guy did intercept it. That's not good. Okay, did you see anything there? The idea in football is to get the ball across the line. You have to get the ball across the line. Yeah. And you see, the problem with this is, and I'm not making light of him, I had to feel really, really, really bad, but it's a good example of when I'm so hungry for something, recognition, reward, get a result, score the touchdown, whatever it is. And I'm not real smart. I'm not really aware of my situation and what's really going on. I lose sense of that. And I'm not humble at all. I'm just ready to go celebrate. Like, that's exactly what caused him to drop the ball early. He couldn't wait to just go celebrate. That's what can happen. So I think that's a good illustration to keep in mind for what it looks like to be a bulldozer. So we've covered the pawn. That's somebody that's humble. We've covered the bulldozer, somebody hungry. Okay, but they're lacking those other two virtues. Let's go to the charmer. And
Real
this
quick,
charmer
Bill, before we
Yep.
jump into that, John has a great comment. I used to have an emotionally abusive advisor who led to lots of my self-doubt and shame. I can resonate with you, Bill. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, well, thanks for saying that, man. I wish we had a long time. I'd love to talk to you about story and that. I think it's so fascinating. I spend so much time with leaders. You know, thanks for saying that. Thanks for encouraging me. You don't know how much that means. Even after telling my story for as long as I have, I still sometimes feel guilty because I was told you don't tell your story. You don't bring your personal life into the business. You don't No, this is who I am. You need to understand. So it's very affirming and very encouraging. And I do thank you for that. Sadly enough, John, unfortunately, I got a little emotional there. I didn't expect that. I think that I was probably the one that left a lot of people in my wake. I didn't know that. I didn't know that. I didn't want to do that. My heart wasn't to do that. But I think I unfortunately left some collateral damage. And I left a lot of people in the wake of my somewhat abusive behavior. You know, alcohol is not the only addiction. Drugs aren't the only addiction. My work was my addiction. I needed a fix every day of somebody telling me I was doing a good job. And I found somebody I did, and they fed that. And it was very unhealthy for me. So thanks for saying that. So they can get by for a while, these charmers. These are interesting folks. Let me say this. It's all about surviving. So here's the deal. They're smart. They're not hungry. They don't care about getting anything done. And they're certainly not humble, or even worse, false humility. We'll talk about that in a second. So the charmer is all about surviving. They're not driven to get things done at all. They're very self-serving. They're only thinking about themselves. They're only leveraging and creating relationships and participating in community, not because they're humble, because it serves them well. You see how that works? Very different motivation of the heart. They lack authenticity. They're not showing you who they are. They'll show you who you need them to be. You recognize this? Compartmentalization? I do. I love this quote by George Costanza. He was my favorite anyways. If you grew up in the 80s, you couldn't help but watch Seinfeld. And George Costanza was quite a character. If you don't know him, it's okay. You can go YouTube him, and it's kind of fun. But he was just funny. And he had this great quote: when you look annoyed all the time, people think you're busy. Well, let's see how that plays out. I hope you can hear this. If you can't,
I always look annoyed. When you look annoyed all the time, people think that you're busy. Think about it. Hi, Mr. Well, don't get me one of those little stress dolls. All right. Back to work. We just got the final budget numbers. We're on the budget on some of the items, but I don't think there's going to be a problem. I'll let you get back to work, George.
hopefully you heard that. Were they able to hear that, Jen?
I heard it, and when I turned my volume all the way up, I could I could hear it very lightly.
Oh, I hope you
I'm not
heard
sure
that.
why.
The general sense of it is, Costanza says, when you look busy, when you look annoyed, the people think you're busy. And so he plays this out all the time. He's smart. He's figured it out. When the boss shows up and gives us something, he's just, I'm so busy. And then he sees him beating the wall at the end. It's really for a fly that he's been watching. But he's beating the wall, and the boss thinks, oh, he's lost it. He's too busy. So these people are smart. They know how to play the system. They figured it out. They know how it works. Okay, let's go a little bit further. So we've covered so far the pawn, we've covered the charmer, and we've covered the bulldozer. The pawn, humble, but not hungry and smart. The charmer is smart, but not humble and hungry. And finally, the bulldozer, who is hungry, but doesn't have humility, and certainly not very smart. So now we're on to the next category, okay? And we're making a little bit of light of this, but I think this is a good way to remember it. I want you to take this back to your workplace and really ask yourself about yourself first. And then if you're a leader and you're putting together teams, I want you to think about this in the context of your current team and how to hire for those folks that are humble, hungry, and smart going forward. All right. The accidental mess maker is humble. That's a good thing. And hungry. They want to get things done, and they're very good intentions. They like to work with other people. They understand their place in the equation, but they want to get something done. So they work hard, good work ethic. They have great intentions. but they leave trouble behind. Why? Because they're not smart. They don't really recognize the system they're working within. They don't know how to network effectively. They don't really, so they inherently leave trouble behind. It's not their desire, but it's what happens because they're not real smart. They ruffle feathers without knowing. They really aren't aware. They aren't aware of the surroundings. They aren't aware of those people. They haven't formed really strong relationships. So they don't really know people real well. So they tend to ruffle feathers without knowing. Their cleanup and apologies are overheard. Eventually, this is how the accidental mess maker gets called out. Eventually, people get tired of all the excuses. Despite the fact that they get things done, and they're a good person with a good heart, with the right desire and good intent, constant cleaning up of their messes gets old really quick. And that's typically how an accidental mess maker gets called out. They are annoying, but they're not necessarily unforgiving. You can work with this. This is the best scenario. If somebody's at least humble and hungry, you can work on the smart piece of the equation. That can be taught, but it needs to be noticed and it needs to be deliberate and intentional. So I won't play this for the sake of time. It's a little clip that really gives you a glimpse of that. So any questions on that one? The accidental mess maker, hungry and humble, wants to get things done, has good intention, but leaves a mess everywhere because they're not real aware of the context in which they're operating. Okay, let's go to lovable slackers. I love this. This is Ferris Bueller. If everybody knows Ferris Bueller. If you don't know the story, he basically learns how to skip school as much as he can and goof around, and eventually gets in a lot of trouble. The principal's always after him because he knows Bueller is messing up and taking off school, but he can never catch him. And Bueller does all kinds of things. He does all kinds of crazy things. He really does. Lovable slackers, like Bueller, are smart and humble. But what's missing? They're not hungry. They're not really about getting anything done. Okay? So he understands community. In fact, his friends are his community. He understands where he's going to operate. He understands the importance of operating in that community really well, and he's smart about it. He knows how to manipulate, even to get a dad's Ferrari. If you look at the guy in the Red Wings jersey, his friend, which that's a great jersey, by the way, his friend, he manipulates him in such a way that he gets him to go and get his dad's prized vehicle to go drive around the city in. And all kinds of crazy things happen. But he's smart. He knows what makes people tick. He knows how to manipulate his friend. Notice I said manipulation. There's a very fine line for leaders, in particular between manipulation and influence. Influence says we all know where we're going and we're all informed along the way and we even have a voice in it. Manipulation, on the other hand, says only the person that's leading the way knows where we're actually going. And our voice really doesn't matter in terms of influencing or changing the trajectory of that. So they're wonderfully frustrating because they are smart. It's difficult. And because they are humble, they're very likable. People generally like them because they have good intentions in that. Well, especially to the ideal team player, somebody that has all of the virtues really gets frustrated here. It's like, they're not getting anything done. What's going on? I'm hungry too. Look at me. And this can be really frustrating. Other team players will typically call these folks out because they'll see it. They'll say they're not getting things done. You might like them and they might be smart and everybody generally gets along and they know how to navigate the system and everybody's just giving them accolades, but they're not getting anything done. Look at me work. Look at my work ethic. And that's typically where they'll get called out. So the lovable slacker constantly causes extra work for other team players to pick up. If they're not doing it, somebody's got to do it. And typically those team players will go, listen, they're not pulling their weight. Their constant coaching and encouragement to do more on their part is required. This is workable, but it is difficult because they're smart. And even if you coach them, they're smart about how to apply it and when to apply it. Very discriminately, not very intentionally, and not very consistently. And that's a problem. So that's a difficult one, but it can be coached. The last one is probably the most dangerous of all. Well, it is. And does anybody notice what's missing here in particular? Which virtue's missing?
Humble.
Yeah, the most important virtue of all. And that's what makes this one so dangerous. And believe me, there's a lot of these. I have a feeling I was this guy. I do. That's hard for me to say, but it is true. I was smart and I was hungry. Hungry for the wrong reason. You've already gone through that with me. But I could easily figure out what made people tick, how to work the system, and that was dangerous. And I didn't know it because to me, it looked like promotion after promotion after promotion after promotion. In corporate America, more skillful politicians get rewarded than any other of the types that I pointed out to you today. It's amazing. The whole reward system is based on that. Hard work, everybody they get along just fine. We don't need humility. We don't really value that as much. They're very self-focused. And if you watch Game of Thrones, that's the example I'm using here. They're
Hunter,
masters.
I think Hunter has a question. You can unmute.
Sorry.
Well, and from most people's perspective, Bill, when we look at leadership, we rarely see them in a team context, and so they do tend to project an appearance of your lone wolf or your singular ambition. So it's hard to look at people in groups that are outside of ours and have a better feeling for that. But I think when you have entire comic strips devoted to that types of personality, that speaks volumes.
Yeah, that's great, Hunter. You're dead on. There's nothing I can add to that. The one thing I will say is because they're smart, this is interesting. And I actually think I did this, unfortunately. Because they're smart, they actually know how to do what? Act like they're humble. They are truly masters in false humility. And I mentioned to you, that is the most dangerous and the most difficult form of humility to deal with. But they're smart. So for a while, it looks like they're humble as well. It's even hard to detect it. But then you start to figure it out over time. All right, I do need to get done here. I want to make sure you've got a little bit of time to chat through these with me. So they are masters in false humility because they're smart. Like I said, they're the most dangerous. They leave the most scars. Okay, that is a really important part. Remember, somebody mentioned, and I thought that was a great thing. They leave like this wake of emotional or mental kind of abuse or damage behind them. That's been referred to in corporate America as, don't worry how many dead bodies we leave behind us. We just need to get the job done. That's kind of a mentality that unfortunately can be a bit pervasive out there. So they're clearly ambitious. They work hard as long as it benefits them. It's all about them. And because they lack humility, they have no understanding or even value the importance of collaboration, community, and working together. All right, so I want to go back to the model real quick. Let me get through this real quick. I promise I'll wrap because I want to answer your questions too. You might have some. I don't want to do this. We'll just go past that. So there's your model. You've got the three virtues: humble, hungry, and smart. That's an ideal team player. Again, if you're a leader and you're hiring, I would really seriously consider those three virtues and how important they are, and make sure that they're at least adequate in each one of those. You have each of the different character types here. The pawn, who's humble but not hungry and smart. The bulldozer, who's hungry but not smart or humble. And the charmer, who's smart but is significantly deficient in humility and hunger. And then you can kind of work your way in through that model. But I really want to show you what it looks like, the ideal team player, when it's all working together well. We're going to go to another football analogy, and I'll end on this point. It's the very last play. You can see it, 3 seconds left. It's 31-31. It's a playoff. The stakes are very high. Dallas and Green Bay are playing. Green Bay's getting ready to kick a field goal, okay? It's very important. I want you to call out what you see in chat or just come off mute. I want you to call out the attributes or virtues that you see that make this team a collective group of ideal team players. And that is the Green Bay Packers in this case, okay? Here we go. That was good, by the way. They won. Okay, I want you to watch it one more time, and then we're going to go to all the chat. You can start chatting now, or you can absolutely. What attributes do you see? That last part's important too. Yep. Okay. All right. What'd you see?
They were celebrating together.
Ha! Who said that? That's awesome. This was a team celebration. Is that Zach?
Yes.
Yeah. You nailed. Did you notice that? They all went around the kicker, but they all kind of celebrated together. Then you go to the sideline and they're celebrating. There was a collective team, right? Congratulatory. There wasn't any taunting. That's unusual. Somebody's usually spiking the ball or doing a dance or doing something out there. I think what's really interesting is look how they're lined up. Do you see those two guys? I played a little bit. So, and if you played, you'll know. Those two guys on the end for Dallas and the other guy on the other end. So on the left side, you'd see one guy and two guys open on the other side. This is everybody working together. Everybody's got to make precisely the right block, and there aren't enough people to block every player, every Dallas player. So you have to make a decision to make sure you block the right player. And everybody has to do this or this thing falls apart. Now, it almost gets blocked anyways, which is amazing, but it was so precise. And everybody played their position well. Everybody had a servant attitude. There's a sense of humility. They didn't celebrate that way. They played their positions well. They're smart about their positions. And do you think they were hungry? I got the impression that they were pretty hungry about it. They wanted to win. By the way they celebrated, I would say they were extremely hungry to put it through those goalposts. You can kind of see it all kind of come together here. Dedicated. Yeah, that's a great word. I love it. So you can kind of see it all come together here. And I think it's a pretty good illustration of what an ideal team player looks like. All right, I'm going to end there. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to open it up for any questions you might have. And I'm happy to answer anything. Somebody's got to talk. It's so awkward, man.
I have a question.
Oh, thank you.
So you mentioned in your story, which are really touching and inspiring, you mentioned you've been sacrificing your true identity. So my question is like, how do we actually get in touch with our true identity?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, I think, can I give you, I'm going to have to give you the short answer. I got 3 minutes. So it's a great question, John. I think C.S. Lewis characterized it best. I wish I had understood the importance of going on my own personal pursuit of what was important to me. You know, I have two sons that work here at HCA. They were both just promoted to manager, by the way. Did I just brag? I did. I'm so proud of them, though. And I watch how they're doing life very differently than I did. They are very comfortable with who they are. And they've really interrogated themselves to a level that I didn't do until my 50s, honestly, 40s and 50s. And so you've got to make a decision to go on a personal pursuit. It's intentional. It's purpose-driven. It requires others to speak into it because you're not going to see it yourself. It means you're going to have to be extremely vulnerable. For me, it meant counseling. It meant I had to go tell my story and really open up to who I was to people that didn't even know me and accept their perspective about what is. That's a real place of vulnerability. And if you don't decide that path, then your second option is let life happen to you and let your wife of 40 some years tell you that because you don't live in this house anymore, emotionally, physically, or mentally, we got to have a change. I mean, this is my high school sweetheart. This is Donna. And I'm not present is what she's trying to tell me. You know, there's a dose of humility that comes with that. Don't put yourself in that place if you can help it. That's not fun. So I hate to borrow that from C.S. Lewis, but I can't give you anything more than that except say, understand the importance and go on that pursuit yourself, or something in life is going to do it for you. And I hope it's just not too late.
And I guess
This is
listen to
amazing. Thank
others.
you, Bill.
Yep. What?
I said, and you know, what I just took from what you said was to really listen to others. When they say things, don't just be quick to dismiss it. Really, maybe stop and think about what they said.
Yeah, absolutely. What a great point, Jen. Yeah. Hey, you got to believe that others mean, don't just go listen. Hey, reflective listening is this. If I understood you correctly, I think you were saying, yes, I was. Okay, good. We've got a common understanding. Active listening is how I got to Tennessee. I'd love to tell you that story, but it looks like this. I'm so interested in what you're saying, and you're so interested in receiving what I have to invest in you by virtue of what you're saying, that we have a mutual relationship forming here. And it's really powerful because I can speak into you and you value it and you desire it. That's hard to get to. You got to be very humble to do that because we all think we got ourselves figured out. In reality, we don't at all. All right. I'm into psychology.
Go ahead,
Yeah.
Hunter.
Yeah, so just speaking to the previous question about finding out who you are, I think there's this huge misconception that who we are is very static. And so instead, if you look at yourself as a set of skills where you have your strengths and your weaknesses, then you can inventory those and then decide which of your weaknesses you want to become stronger in. And then you put yourselves in situations and you challenge yourselves and you acquire and you learn and you develop those. And so, you can take the things like Myers-Briggs and you can change over a 15-year period, depending on the experiences that you've chosen to engage in.
That's good. That's good, Hunter. Yes. It is every year I covenant with my wife, with my kids, even with my grandkids now. And what it does, it causes me to examine. I ask them, where are areas that are blind spots for me? Because I'm interested in what they have to say. And they're the people that know me most intimately. They know the good, the bad, and the ugly. And then there's some trusted colleagues that I go to that also know me in accountability groups and otherwise. So yeah, but it's constant. You got to constantly be in pursuit of it. It's intentional. It's purposeful. Yep.
And Chris
Good.
said
Well said.
weaknesses equal growth points, Chris says.
Ah, yeah. Hey, be okay with your weakness. It's a good thing. Know what you don't know. It's okay. It's all right. It's good. Self-awareness is really important. Yeah.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much, Bill, for doing this.
You're very
been
welcome.
a very valuable session. And thank you so much, everybody, for attending. And Bill, thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for having me. I really appreciate it.